Tonight on Nation to Nation, an Ontario chief says the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission did not meet duty to consult obligations when it approved the construction of a nuclear waste disposal site.
We're just really disappointed that they did not, in our opinion, take, the information that we provided and our concerns into consideration.
The Child and Family Caring Society says the federal government is violating Jordan's principle when it comes to providing health services to First Nations children quickly.
We found out that they were actually not even opening requests. There were thousands of requests that they hadn't even opened, and some of those requests were urgent.
And McGill University professor Veldon Coburn says we shouldn't get our hopes up too high when it comes to spending on Indigenous priorities in the upcoming federal budget.
They just might announce old money in this particular budget for programming that they've yet to get around to for upcoming years where that money was promised already.
Welcome to the first episode of Nation to Nation for 2024. I'm Fraser Needham. It's been a long process that began back in 2016, but earlier this week, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission approved the construction of a nuclear waste disposal site at the Chalk River Laboratories facility in Deep River, Ontario. Nuclear disposal sites of any type are controversial, and this one is no different. A number of environmental organizations and area First Nations have challenged this disposal site at every turn. This includes the Kaiba'awek First Nation, whose Chief Lance Haymond joins me today. Welcome to Nation, Chief Haymond.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity.
All right, so I imagine you're still trying to digest this decision, although I thought I would ask you how you feel about it, and I imagine not you're disappointed, but maybe not necessarily surprised.
You're bang on. We anticipated that the decision would be positive, so we are not surprised. We're just really disappointed that they did not, in our opinion, take, the information that we provided and our concerns into consideration prior to issuing the license to construct the NSDF.
And we'll come back to that in a second, but I guess this is what's called, my understanding, is a low-level nuclear disposal site. But this still remains a concern for your First Nation. Can you tell me why that is and how that is as well, what it affects in the environment?
Sure. So the concerns that we have, and when they characterize the waste as low risk, I think that's kind of a false statement, because the existing waste on site is not all low waste. It's the low to intermediate waste. So, and what are they going to be doing with everything that's not low waste? The problem that we see is the fact that this waste in its current form is already leaching and has already, impacted and poisoned, the area in and around the Chalk River site. And the fact that the site is already leaching radioactive contaminants into the Ottawa River in the form of tritium causes us great concern that as they build a facility and ultimately begin storing, they know, and we all are aware, that they're going to use Perch Creek as a natural way to treat some of this radioactive waste, in the hopes that by the time it hits the Ottawa River, it will be at a level that meets provincial norms. So yes, we have great concerns, but our other greatest concern is the fact that this project will have huge impacts on the territory and the fauna and the animals that live there. As part of our studies and research, we showed CNSC that there are active bear dens. There's eastern wolves, which are an endangered species on the species at risk list that live there. And one of the first things they're going to do is raise down 37 hectares of that territory where those animals exist. And so the impacts are far-reaching and, yeah, scary.
Yes, I know that there's been, I think there was a report that your First Nation worked with and other organizations, and so that was quite detailed and outlined some of these things. The other issue that comes to that particularly affects you and the other area First Nations that are involved in this is the duty to consult obligations that are supposed to happen with Indigenous communities in the lead up to approval of a project like this. The report says that they have been met. Is that correct?
It is not. If you been following our story, you know that we had to intervene at a hearing in June of 2022 before the CNSC, at which time they were prepared to issue that license. And we were able to demonstrate, along with the community of Kitigan-Zibi and the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, that we had not been adequately consulted. And so the commission gave us a 9-month extension. But quite frankly, you know, in the 9 months that we were there and what we saw and what we were able to collect, the data that we were able to collect, it caused us more concerns and really have put us on a path where we can't let this project move forward.
Now, I know that your First Nation, I'm assuming, and the other groups are just not going to lie down on this, of course, that they're going to continue to fight the decision. So what do you think will happen now, or what will you be part of now?
Well, what our initial plan is, as you saw from our press release, we intend to go and try and meet with Prime Minister Trudeau and the Minister of the Environment and the Minister for NRCan, with a view to convince them that, look, you know, your government has failed, and the right thing to do is to cancel this project based on the fact that there's no reconciliation. There's impacts on our inherent rights. And so that'll be a first step. We currently have a number of, you know, support organizations and our legal folks who are doing the review of the decision. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 160-page decision. I mean, we expect that we'll get some information back in not too distant future, but we made it clear that we are looking, if we are not successful in getting the government to cancel this project, at what our legal options are. And we believe that there's merit for a judicial review based on the fact that CNSC has indicated that consultation is adequate, which we wholeheartedly disagree, and that there will be no adverse environmental impacts. And we believe that based on those two issues alone, we may have grounds for you know, some type of legal action, possibly a judicial review. Barring that, we intend to continue to hammer away through our social media. I would not be surprised if my community and nation and our non-Indigenous supporters, you know, go out and publicly protest what is happening. And again, we'll keep all options on the table in terms of, you know, what we're going to do. But right now it's try and look at what our legal options are and take it from there.
Right. So basically, the fight is far from over, but I guess we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately, for time reasons. But thanks very much for joining us and keeping us up to date. It's such a big issue for not only, as you know, for this area, but for Canada, really. And thanks very much for keeping us up to date on some of the work you're doing and always being available.
Thank you very much.
Up next, we'll have First Nations Child and Family Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock to talk about how the federal government is not meeting Jordan's Principle when it comes to providing services to First Nations families in a timely fashion. You're watching Nation to Nation, and I'm Fraser Needham. The First Nations Child and Family Caring Society is once again taking the federal government to task. This time it is over what the organization says is a failure to comply with Jordan's Principle when it comes to the provision of health services for First Nations children in a timely manner. Tomorrow, the Caring Society will file an affidavit with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on the issue. And today, Executive Director Cindy Blackstock joins me in our Ottawa studio to talk about what is going on. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Cindy, and Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you.
Well, once again, we sort of had discussed this a little bit previous, but from my understanding is there's an issue of wait times for children and families, you know, trying to get child welfare services. This is not supposed to happen according to Jordan's Principle, and you've kind of filed an application with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal about it.
Yeah, we found actually a whole series of serious non-compliance issues by the Canadian government, which we flagged before. We tried to help them fix them, and it just hasn't worked. And the harms are continuing to pile up on First Nations families. Just to give you a couple of examples, is we found out that they were actually not even opening requests. There were thousands of requests that they hadn't even opened, and some of those requests were urgent. And so families, out of desperation, were reaching out to us. Some of those cases were tragedies where children are seriously ill or in palliative care, or people who are trying to flee a domestic violence situation or flee forest fires and had children involved who had special needs. And because the Canadian government didn't even open up the email, they weren't getting relief, and the danger they were facing was much higher. So we've tried numerous ways of trying to raise a red flag with Canada, always offering solutions, and really hitting a brick wall. So we have filed this non-compliance motion back in December, and we'll be going back to the tribunal to try and get them to comply again with the sacred spirit of Jordan's Principle.
Right, and maybe you can, for our viewers, explain a little bit about why this doesn't meet the commitment that they have made under Jordan's Principle.
It's not even the commitment they made, it's the legal order that has been against them. So the legal order said, look, you know, children only get one childhood, and as you know, when they have a need, you got to meet it pretty immediately, right? So the tribunal said, if you make an individual request for a child, that the government, if it's urgent, has to determine it within 12 hours, and if it's a non-urgent request for an individual child, within 48 hours. And then for group requests, because you might have a group of children say they need mental wellness interventions, if it's urgent, then it has to be determined within 48 hours, and if it's non-urgent, within 7 days. Now, the government did not appeal that decision, meaning they accepted that decision. But it's clear they're not meeting it, and we're not convinced that they're taking measures in order to meet those orders, and we're really worried about all these families that are, you know, in this unopened email train of people trying to request. The further problem is that they have a 24-hour line where you're supposed to be able to reach out and get help. Well, I have called that thing about 13 times, and I've only received an answer one time. And these agents are either not available, or you get this long message saying that they're busy, and you'll have to leave a message and hope you call back. I've had one call back from those 13 calls. So that means that people in urgent circumstances, they can't get access by putting in a request in their normal process, because they're months and months and months behind. And then if it becomes urgent, or it is urgent, you may not be able to get an answer at the 24-hour line.
So what then happens to somebody? I mean, they try to, you know, they may not understand the system completely. They're trying to get help. Yeah. You say it's not working at all. You only had one. So what happens then to some of these people?
Well, some of these people end up at our office, and we've actually used some of our funds, you know, our Spirit Bear books and stuff and calendars we sell. Well, we use that money to help families out in an emergency. But we're also hearing from First Nations who are at the grassroots level are saying, well, I can't allow that child to suffer. So they're paying for these costs for Canada. And then they're hoping they get reimbursed. And in many cases, this is like adding up to tens of thousands of dollars, which is driving them into deficit. The other piece that we've heard is a concern is service providers. So we may have somebody out there, I don't know, delivering occupational therapy, for example, in a northern area. And as you know, there's not a lot of people doing that kind of work. Well, they're providing the services even when they're approved, and then sometimes they're waiting months and months and months to get paid, putting their actual ability to operate in jeopardy, because, you know, they have to pay rent, they have to pay their staff, and that's meaning that there are less professionals who are able to help families who have Jordan's Principle cases. So that the payment issue is a real problem too.
Can you tell our viewers a little bit about these are often unfortunate, like you know, someone's trying to navigate a bureaucratic system with a very unfortunate, often circumstance. These are serious issues. Yeah. What does that do to some of the? I mean, that must be really hard on some of these people.
Oh, it's been really, really hard. I mean, some of the cases we've seen, for example, are children who have lost a sibling and a parent in this case, and there was a memorial coming up. And these children, of course, it's a cultural memorial, and that's really important to their healing. I mean, you can't imagine the loss that these kids suffered. But the family was spending all the time trying to get help through Jordan's Principle. And that deepened the harm for that child, right? And those children in that family. They shouldn't, at that sacred time, be trying to reach a bureaucrat and saying, can we get help so we can make sure that these children are supported and are able to attend this memorial. So that's when, those are the types of circumstances when First Nations, when service providers or folks like us step in and say, well, look, you know, we can fund a couple nights hotel and a whatever so that you can do this. But that's not what was supposed to happen. Once you have a professional letter of a child with a need and you have the guardian's consent, then it should happen really quickly. And government often says, oh, well, it gets complicated, we get lots of requests. But you know what I think about, Fraser? I think about COVID-19. When they rolled out CERB to millions and millions and millions of people, almost on a overnight basis, that was a good thing. They rolled out the vaccines to millions and millions and millions of people. So governments can do complicated things with high volume and do them well. I just don't understand why they're not doing it here.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there, but obviously a very serious issue, of course, that you're looking into involving First Nations children and their families that have issues continued with the government. And thanks once again for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. And if Canada just kept its promises and followed legal orders, we wouldn't have to bring these motions.
Exactly. Well, thanks again. Up next, we'll talk to McGill University professor Veldon Coburn about what Indigenous priorities may or may not be in the upcoming federal budget. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. It's a new year, and with it come out new legislation, policies, and a spring budget from the Trudeau government in Ottawa. After record spending on Indigenous priorities over the last few years, some observers are predicting this will be a tighter budget. But many financial and other commitments to Indigenous people remain unfulfilled. Joining us today to talk about what we might see in the upcoming year from the federal government for Indigenous people, financial and otherwise, is a familiar face to viewers, McGill University professor Veldon Coburn. Welcome back to the show, Veldon.
Thanks for having me, Fraser.
And Happy New Year, of course.
Happy New Year to
right.
you.
So in the lead up, we were kind of talking about, you know, what it's going to be a tighter budget. There's no doubt about it. We've had this record spending. You know, is there any chance you think we'll see any increased or new spending in Indigenous priorities, for example, housing or healthcare in the new year?
I don't put a lot of hope into increased spending. 2023, we lost one of the more effective ministers that we've ever had, one that had more influence around the cabinet table and perhaps had more pull with the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland. So we see the departure of Mark Miller, and now we have two ministers, Patty Hajdu and then a new face as well too that isn't really as familiar with the portfolio. But where Miller had been in as cabinet minister, he brought record spending, as you mentioned too. So clearly he had a lot more swing and influence as a minister, and brought extraordinary expenditures in terms of historical levels on things like water, and then the settlement of large lawsuits as well too. So a lot of that too was multi-year funding too, so it was going to be rolled out over several years, and you know, we might head into a fixed election date of 2025, depending on if this government does keep to that particular promise or not. But most of the expenditures and the commitments that were made were in previous years, and I think they just might announce old money in this particular budget for programming that they've yet to get around to for upcoming years where that money was promised already.
Now keep in mind it's a new year, so we're trying to be positive here. Yeah. We know how we're just talking about how housing, you know, is affecting Indigenous people big time wherever you go. Not only on reserve, of course, but in cities like here in Ottawa, and we talked about the situation. And so there's like Indigenous people need housing, affordable housing or shelter, but they're making up a larger proportion of the homeless population. Like in Edmonton, do you think we may see anything positive there?
Well, between the urban population and those Indigenous peoples who, say, if you're First Nations and you're circulating from the reserve into the metropolitan centers that become provincial jurisdiction, I think the federal provincial policy and approach has always been spend more money on incarceration. So the unofficial policy has been to spend, well, I mean, to house an incarcerated individual for a year is over $100,000 per year. So it's bad fiscal policy. However, in recent times, in the last day or so, we saw some encampments where the population happens to be particularly Indigenous heavy. So the homelessness problem continues to run rampant. There are divisions between jurisdictions where they sort of volley it back and forth. But if they induce individuals that live on reserves, for example, because of underfunding for housing, it's still a long-standing colonial policy of underdevelopment and almost kind of willful impoverishment of individuals. So they really don't have any opportunity to when they go to the cities. But the conditions for living in these homes where they do on reserve, for example, still faced with poor housing quality, housing shortages, and to speak to the equality, it can be water and wastewater matters as well too. So those were things that Mark Miller attempted to address with the large expenditures, but yeah, we're still dealing with housing shortages and poor housing quality for Indigenous peoples, and it's sad to see that most of them find housing in the prisons.
Yes, yeah, it's something, as you say, that the correctional investigator has mentioned several times, but with very little progress in his tenure there. So, good point. Yeah. Let's move on to another new person. Of course, you talked about Anna Sonnegury. We of course have Cindy Woodhouse as the new national chief of the AFN. Of course, now the second female elected chief of the organization in a short period of time. So, what? Obviously, there was a lot of turmoil at the organization over the last couple of years. I mean, it was dysfunctional with this thing with Archibald and all the fighting went on. What do you think will happen now, and what do you think their relationship will be like with the federal government?
Oh, it's difficult to say. I think it might just be status quo as well. So the last National Chief Archibald, she at least stood up against this government. I've yet to see any sort of movement here with Cindy Woodhouse as she's assumed the national chief. Of course, she's very new in it as well. And there was still division amongst the First Nations when we had our special assembly for voting in just the last month or so. Perhaps there's some divides within First Nations politics that they might have to see a little bit of unity, but also the organization itself in the last 15, 20 years, its purpose for many political observers might say it's lost its way. So whether or not this new national chief will bring it out of the wilderness, and you know, some have seen it being a bit of an appendage of whatever sort of governing party may be, even part of the bureaucracy as well too. So too tightly close linked with working committees and task forces they might be on things that they might be seen internally for the Crown Indigenous Relations or Indigenous Services Canada, for the two larger departments, as putting a rubber stamp on departmental developed policies and programs. Whether or not it'll develop more teeth, I guess we'll have to see under new National Chief Woodhouse.
All right, well, we'll have to end it there. But once again, thanks very much for joining us on Nation to Nation this week, Veldon.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Happy New Year and good night.